Good evening, wherever you are tonight. Thank you for letting me be a voice in your silence. This is Love and Tears, a place where the stories of love and loss are told gently as if whispered into the night. Here we read anonymous letters sent to us by people who once loved deeply and lost quietly. They write not to be heard by the world, but to finally let go of something they've held on to for far too long. Tonight's letter comes from a woman who waited with her heart full of hope and a wedding dress she never got to wear. The boy she loved promised to return, but instead of a smile, what arrived was a siren. This is her letter. I was 19 when he left. Just a boy in a uniform, barely taller than me, grinning like the world couldn't hurt him. He held my hand and said, "Wait for me. I'll be back before you know it." So I waited. Every week I wrote letters. Every day I watched the mailbox. Until the day it wasn't a letter. It was a knock. And two men in uniform. We'll begin her story after this moment of stillness. I was 19, and I thought I understood forever. He wasn't the first boy I loved, but he was the first one who loved me back, in the way I needed to be loved. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way people love when they already imagine growing old with you. His name was Daniel, and I met him on a rainy afternoon at the library, trying to find a book that neither of us ended up reading. He was tall, but not too tall. His hands were always cold, and he had this way of smiling, like he was in on a secret that only I could understand. We started meeting there every Tuesday, then Thursdays, then every day. And just like that, he became my person. We talked about getting married, about saving money, about driving to the mountains with nothing but a map and a tank full of gas. I still have the little list we wrote together, things to do before we're old. But then the letter came, the draft notice. Daniel had always said he'd go if they called. He believed in duty, in honor, in just a few months and I'll be back. He packed his things like he was going to camp, left me a notebook filled with scribbles and promises, and kissed me on the forehead before boarding the bus. "Wait for me," he said, "I'll be back before you know it." And so I waited. I wrote him every single day. Little things, like how the cat knocked over the vase again, or how Mrs. Lang down the street finally trimmed her awful hedges. I didn't know what kind of war stories he wanted to hear, so I filled my letters with home, warmth, familiar things, the sound of me, waiting. He replied every week, sometimes just a few lines, but I read those pages like scripture. I folded them carefully, tied them with a ribbon I still keep in the top drawer of my nightstand. The last letter came in July. He wrote about missing the smell of my hair, about dreaming of coffee and pancakes, about the ring he had already bought. "I'll be back by September," he said. "Start looking at dresses, okay?" So I did. I brought my mother to the dress shop, tried on something simple, ivory lace. The woman at the counter said I looked like someone waiting for a miracle. I smiled, because I was. But the miracle never came. One morning in August, I saw the military car parked outside, and I already knew. The doorbell didn't ring. They just stood there. Two men in uniform, one older, the other younger, both with eyes that had seen this moment far too many times. They didn't have to say anything, not really. I saw the envelope in the older one's hand, the way he looked down when I opened the door, and I held onto the doorknob like it could hold me back from falling. "Miss Evelyn Marks?" I nodded. "We're sorry to inform you." That's all I remember. Not the full sentence, not the way my knees gave out, not the scream that didn't make it out of my mouth. Only the silence afterward. Heavy. So heavy I thought the walls would collapse from it. They handed me a small box. Inside was the ring. Simple silver, engraved with the words, "For always." There was no letter, just a folded photo. The one I'd sent him with my second letter, me in the backyard, barefoot, smiling like I believed he'd really come home. I sat on the floor that night, ring in one hand, photo in the other, and let the silence break me. Heavy with memory. The funeral was 2 weeks later. Closed casket. They said it was better that way. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just sat there in the front row, wearing the dress I bought for our engagement dinner. I remember the way my mother reached for my hand, but I couldn't feel her fingers. I couldn't feel anything. People came and said things like he was a hero. He died for the country. At least he's at peace now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say he wasn't just a soldier. He was the boy who kissed my eyelids when I had headaches, who memorized my favorite ice cream flavor, who told me I snored when I fell asleep on his shoulder. Breaks slightly. But I said nothing, because grief doesn't come with a language. Just waves. Big ones, small ones, endless ones. And in the days after, I realized something cruel. The world keeps spinning, even when yours has stopped. The bus still ran at 7 a.m. The mail still came. Mrs. Lang still complained about her tomatoes. And I still had to wake up every day in a world where Daniel didn't exist anymore. For weeks after the funeral, I kept waiting for something that didn't make sense. Not Daniel himself, but a sign, a dream, a knock on the door that would somehow undo the one before it. I slept in his old hoodie, held the ring in my palm every night like a prayer. I didn't cry much. Grief doesn't always come in tears. Sometimes it comes in long silences, in untouched food, in letters half written, then thrown away. My friends stopped calling after a while. They didn't know what to say, and I didn't have the strength to pretend. I remember walking into the little diner where we used to eat breakfast, ordering his usual, and staring at the empty seat across from me for an hour. The waitress didn't say a word. She just refilled my coffee and placed a napkin beside the cup. On it, she had written, "I miss him too." That was the first time I cried, right there in the middle of a place filled with noise, while the jukebox played something cheerful. Because the world doesn't stop for the broken-hearted, it just turns the volume up. I went through his things a few weeks later. Not all at once, just a drawer here, a box there. There was a notebook filled with silly doodles, a ticket stub from the night we saw that awful movie and laughed the entire way home, and a letter, tucked between the pages of a novel he never finished. "If something happens to me," he wrote, "please don't let it take away your smile. You were always meant for more than mourning." I didn't know what to do with that. More than mourning? How could I be anything else when every part of me had been built around him? But I kept the letter, folded it carefully, placed it inside my journal, and for the first time, picked up a pen to write something back. Not to send, not even to finish, just to start again. And that's the thing about heartbreak. It doesn't end with the goodbye. It ends with the first small act of trying to eat, trying to sleep, trying to remember the sound of your own voice when you're not whispering his name. Say for Alt recalled. I didn't return the dress, the one I bought for our engagement dinner. It hung in my closet for years, still wrapped in that pale paper, the tag still attached, as if returning it would mean admitting the dinner, the proposal, the life was never going to happen. Every now and then, I would open the closet, run my fingers over the fabric, whisper his name under my breath like a prayer no one could hear. There were days I thought about giving it away, but I couldn't, because even if I never wore it, that dress had heard our dreams, felt our plans folded into it, carried the quiet weight of everything that never came true. Place one that was both more than 47 people pay. Sometimes, grief isn't loud. It's not the sobbing or the breaking plates. It's the unopened dress, the plate you keep setting for no one, the way you pause in the middle of a sentence because you almost said we. Saul, steadier tone. That winter, I stopped answering calls. Didn't decorate for Christmas. Didn't write any New Year's resolutions. But I started walking, just down the street, then around the block, until one day I reached the edge of town without realizing it. The world looked different without him in it. But it was still the same world, the same sky, the same brittle air, the same smell of chimney smoke in December. I found a little park with a bench, and I started bringing my journal there. Writing. Not poetry, not letters to him anymore, just fragments of thoughts. Things like, today the wind felt like something old. Someone wore his cologne and I almost turned around. I'm still breathing, even if it hurts. I didn't know it then, but those moments, those tiny sentences were the start of something. Not healing, not yet, but softening. Like a frozen river just beginning to crack. Spring came quietly that year. The trees bloomed like they didn't know anything had changed. I remember standing under the cherry blossoms watching petals fall like snow and feeling strange that something so beautiful could still happen in a world without him. It made me angry at first. How dare the world bloom while I was still grieving? But then I sat on that same park bench, closed my eyes and listened. Birdsong, children laughing in the distance, the rustle of paper as I opened my journal. Maybe beauty isn't betrayal, I wrote. Maybe it's proof that life continues, even when we don't want it to. That afternoon, an old man walked by and asked if he could sit beside me. He had a cane, a worn hat, and a silence I recognized. We didn't speak much, but as he stood to leave, he turned and said, "Loss doesn't shrink, dear, but with time, your life grows around it." I didn't understand it then, but I wrote it down, and somehow those words held me through another night. A year passed. People thought I was okay again. I smiled more, went back to work, even laughed when the coffee machine exploded in the break room. But grief isn't something you graduate from. It's not linear. It's not polite. It shows up in strange places, like grocery stores, or in the middle of a movie when a character says something he once whispered to you in the dark. I still kept his photo on my nightstand, still wore the ring on a chain around my neck, not because I was stuck, but because those things were part of me. You don't erase a love like that. You learn to carry it differently, less like a wound, and more like a shadow, something always behind you, but no longer blinding. "I'm still here," I wrote in my journal, and somehow that has to be enough. And slowly, that began to feel true. Not every day, not always, but some mornings the coffee didn't taste bitter anymore. But steady. It was around that time I started going back to the library, the same one where we met. The shelves were older now, some of the tables scratched and worn, but the smell of paper, the warmth of silence, it was all still there. I sat by the same window, the one where he once rested his head on my shoulder and whispered that he'd read every boring book in the world just to keep sitting beside me. I didn't pick up any books that day. I just sat, letting memory and present overlap like two transparent pages of the same story. A young man sat across from me, maybe 20, maybe younger. He reminded me of Daniel, not in the way he looked, but in the way he fidgeted when he tried to concentrate. At one point, he looked up and smiled politely. Just a small, fleeting thing. But it made me realize the world still holds kindness, even when it's quiet, even when you think it's forgotten you. I started noticing things again. The way the light filtered through the curtains in the morning, the smell of cinnamon from the bakery down the street, how the mailman always hummed a little tune when he walked past my porch. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I was awake, present, and presence, I learned, is the first step toward peace. One morning, I passed by a flower shop. There was a small display of sunflowers out front, the kind Daniel once said reminded him of my laugh. Bright and impossible to ignore, he used to say. I bought one. Just one, brought it home, placed it in a small glass on the windowsill. It wilted after a few days, but I didn't throw it away. I let it fade, slowly, gracefully, because some things deserve to stay, even if only for a little while. Not everything beautiful lasts, I wrote that day, but it's still worth bringing home. As time moved forward, I stopped counting how many days it had been. It wasn't forgetting, it was surrender. I let myself remember him, not just in sorrow, but in softness. The way he laughed when he tripped over his own shoelaces. The way he always put 2 sugars in my coffee, even though he hated sweet things. I began to write about him again, not in elegies, but in stories. There was a boy, I'd start, who once tried to teach me how to whistle and failed miserably, but never gave up. I didn't write for anyone else, just for myself, to make sure his memory didn't harden into tragedy. Because when we reduce someone to their final moment, we erase all the laughter that came before it. Daniel was not a death, he was a life, and I had the honor of living inside it, even if just for a little while. One afternoon I visited his grave, not out of obligation, not because it was a holiday, but because I simply missed him. I brought the journal, read him a few entries, told him about the sunflower, about the boy in the library, about how I finally learned to bake without setting off the smoke alarm. There was a breeze that day, light like fingers running through your hair. And for a moment, as the wind rustled through the trees, I felt it, that strange, quiet knowing that he was proud of me. Not because I moved on, but because I stayed kind, because I didn't let the grief make me smaller. You said I was made for more than mourning, I whispered. I think I'm starting to believe you. I left a single flower. Not a sunflower this time, just a white daisy, small, simple, and still alive. In the years that followed, I didn't fall in love again, not right away. But I did learn how to love life again, the little things. Fresh bread in the morning, rain tapping against the windows, a favorite song playing in the background while I folded laundry. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt, no cinematic turning point. Just slow, quiet days that didn't ache quite as much. And that was enough. One day, a neighbour moved in next door, older gentleman, widowed. He brought me cookies he'd baked himself, slightly burned, but kind. We didn't talk about our pasts, we just sat on our porches sometimes. Two people, drinking tea, watching the sky shift from orange to deep navy. It wasn't love, but it was comfort. And I began to understand something. Not every chapter needs a romance. Some just need rest. Still, there were nights when I missed Daniel so deeply it hurt to breathe. I'd wake up and reach for him, forgetting for a second, just a second, that he wasn't there. But grief, like love, changes form over time. It doesn't go away, it just grows quieter, more patient. And I think so did I. I stopped trying to measure happiness by how loud it was. I started to see joy in stillness, peace in routine. One autumn evening, I found an old letter of his I thought I'd lost. It was short, a little smudged, and near the end he had written, "Even if I don't make it back, please live a life that makes you feel proud to have loved me." I read that line 3 times, then again, and something in me settled, like a door that had been creaking for years finally found its hinge. "I'm trying," I whispered, "every single day. I'm trying." My niece came to visit that summer. She was only 16, wide-eyed, full of questions, and already convinced love would ruin her one day. I smiled, not because she was wrong, but because she was more right than she knew. We sat on the porch one evening, drinking lemonade, watching fireflies blink like tiny lanterns across the yard. Out of nowhere, she asked, "Did you ever love someone that much?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked up at the stars and let the silence speak for me. Then I said, "Yes, and I still do." She didn't ask more. She just rested her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that my story had a place in someone else's world again. Sometimes, healing isn't about forgetting, it's about being witnessed, even by someone too young to understand it all. Later that night, I opened the old wooden box where I kept everything from Daniel. Letters, photos, the ring, and that list. Things to do before we're old. I hadn't looked at it in years. The ink was faded, but the words still carried weight. Camping under the stars, starting a garden, learning how to waltz. Some we did, some we never got to. But one line caught my eye. Grow old together or not, but never stop loving. It didn't sound tragic anymore, it sounded real, like something a young man would write, not knowing how little time he had, but knowing exactly how much he felt. I took out a pen, wrote next to it, "Still growing, still loving." And in that moment I felt closer to him than I had in years, not because he was coming back, but because I had carried him this far without ever letting go. I sat down that evening with a cup of tea and a quiet heart. No sadness, no aching, just the stillness that comes when you've lived with something long enough that it no longer startles you. And I began to write. Not in my journal, not for myself, but for him. Dear Daniel, it's been so long, and yet there are days when I still hear your voice like you just stepped out of the room. I used to be afraid of forgetting you. Now I know I never could. Because you didn't just live in those short years, you live in the way I see kindness, in the way I pause when the wind brushes my cheek, in the way I still look for sunflowers in the spring. You didn't just love me then, you shaped the way I understand love now. Thank you for loving me so well even when time didn't. Thank you for being the reason I believe something beautiful can still grow, even from loss. Tone filled with peace, acceptance. I didn't fold the letter, didn't seal it in an envelope, didn't take it to his grave. Instead, I left it on the windowsill, right next to the sunflower vase, letting the late summer breeze lift its corners and carry it, not to a place, but to a memory. It wasn't goodbye. It was never meant to be. It was a thank you. A quiet closing of a chapter whose pages I'll still revisit every now and then, not to mourn, but to remember, to smile, to say, we didn't get forever, but we had enough. And maybe, just maybe, that's all love ever promises us. Enough to change us, enough to carry us, enough to keep something inside us alive, long after the person is gone. Fine to a whisper. And I am still alive, still growing, still loving, just like you asked me to. Sometimes I wonder what kind of man Daniel would have become if he'd made it home. Would we have fought about who forgot to take out the trash? Would we have danced in the kitchen at 70? Would we have had grey hair and grandkids and stories that started with "remember when"? But I no longer cry when I wonder, because I know this. He gave me the kind of love that didn't need years to prove itself. It only needed moments, honest ones, quiet ones, ones that still echo every time I close my eyes. He didn't stay long, but he stayed enough, and I kept living, not in spite of him, but because of him. If you're listening to this tonight, maybe with the lights low, your heart a little heavy, your chest aching in a place you can't quite name, I want you to know something. Grief is not a failure to move on. It is love's afterglow. It is the echo of something worth remembering. So write the letter, wear the necklace, keep the photo. You don't have to let go to move forward. Daniel once told me, "You were always more than mourning." It took me years to believe it, but now I do. And so, to the boy who promised he'd come back, to the boy who couldn't, this is my last letter. Not goodbye, but thank you. For the love, for the loss, for teaching me how to carry both. Wherever you are tonight, may you remember that too.